Okay, I think we're about ready to get going. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the Enterprise Engineering Colloquium. For over 30 years, the Colloquium has been a forum for Cornell alumni to share their experiences in industry with Cornell students and the Cornell community. I am the faculty organizer, John Callister. I would like to thank the many members of the faculty and staff who have helped me put this colloquium together this semester. And I'd like to especially acknowledge Pat Gillespie and Bonna Davidson for their help this week. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Paul Hayre has an electrical engineering from Cornell and an MBA from Harvard. I'd like to also mention some of the things that he does other than his companies, but he'll be talking about today. He has been a member of the Cornell University Council, the Cornell Alumni Advisory Board, the College of Engineering Dean's Advisory Council, the Cornell Engineering Alumni Association Board of Directors, the Cornell Admissions Interviewer Network, the ENGRG 1052 Course Alumni Advisor and Mentor Network, the Harvard Business School Alumni Advisory Board, the Harvard Business School Rock Center New Ventures Judge and Mentor, the Harvard Business School Healthcare Alumni Student Mentor and Dinner Forum host, the Northeastern University Experiential Network Executive Mentor and Corporate Sponsor, the Worcester Polytechnic Institute Venture Forum Advisory Board, and 5-minute pitch contest judge, and he has served as a sponsor, mentor, and advisor for undergraduate and graduate students at numerous engineering, biomedical, and entrepreneurial programs. The title of his talk today is Engineering, Entrepreneurship, and Enlightenment, Reflections on 5 Startups That Not Even the Dalai Lama Could Have Advised Me. Please welcome Paul Hayre.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that enthusiastic clapping to make up for this Zoom forum, but it's always interesting to see how people pass jokes. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to meet with this auspicious group. And I saw several very familiar names, so it's a hi to I have a few friends that have jumped on as well that I have run around in engineering circles with throughout my Cornell years. So it's great to see a lot of new faces and also a handful of familiar ones as well. And John, thanks for the crew. I know that a lot goes into putting this together. So again, it's a real thrill to be here. You had asked that we kind of, if you guys aren't asleep already by now from all that introduction that John gave, no reflection on John, purely a reflection on the long list. But if we can, I would love to have this be engaging. So we would love to have you ask any questions if something's not clear or you'd like it's anything that we're discussing at the moment. If you have a question, please speak up. If you want to keep your microphones off of mute, if there's no background noise, that's perfectly fine. But we'd love to hear from you throughout the discussion and hope to make this a discussion. In my estimation, it's not embarrassing not to know something, but it is embarrassing not to ask. So I hope you'll take that to heart. And I think something, if people talk about what does it mean to be an engineer, if there is such a thing as an engineering mindset, I think that's exactly who we are. We're ferocious about learning, and sort of the best and most mind-opening phrase I think you can ever put out there is "I don't know," because that invites A, you to activate your ears, and B, for others to provide lots of different ideas on a topic. So there is no harm in that, and I would love to engage in questions as we go through the discussion. To put a little more personal sort of a character on who I am, I had the first date with my wife when I was a senior at Cornell, and there's a picture of us on our first date. In fact, we met, I saw from Dr. Callister's notes that usually there'd be a retreat to Banfi's for a discussion after these colloquium, but you can't do that in this modern world in which we live right now. But anyway, I first met my wife at Banfi's, so it's also a special place for both of us. We have 3 kids. You can see a picture from that we took. This was now 6-7 years ago. My 3 children. This is Nick, this is Alex, and this is Jackie, and this is us in Cappadocia in Turkey. And you can see part of what it means to be a big red Cornellian is that when you do have children, you have to torture them and buy as much Cornell gear as you can so that you have tons of pictures where they're wearing the Cornell gear. Here's a more recent picture of the trio. And then after our 2,163rd date, which happens to be in Ithaca in 2019, which is probably one of the last big events that we attended before things changed. This is the two of us more recently. My wife, by the way, I will say, I am the lesser half in the relationship. She is really a world-renowned pediatric radiologist. She's a bone expert, pediatric bone expert. There are few that understand the pediatric musculoskeletal as she does. In fact, she was featured as, I believe it was maybe 25 or 50 prominent Cornell alums in the Society of Women Engineers published a book, and she was featured in that book as well. So I am, again, to say it, the lesser half of the two of us. To jump into sort of the professional side, to give you, when I was doing this, I thought of many different ways to talk about it without boring you to tears about my background, since I'm now, this summer will be my 30th Cornell reunion. So I kind of bookend my experience now, graduated in 91 and now 30 years later. I wish I could be back on campus, but I nonetheless will be celebrating my 30th reunion just in a month and a half, 2 months. But in trying to sort of document the, an easily digestible way to look at what my career, I kind of did it in sort of decades. So if I have 3 decades since I left Cornell, I broke it into those 3 decades. Each of these bars represents a decade of career work. And then the font size represents how much time I spent doing that thing. So it's kind of interesting to me, but my longest career stint was right out of Cornell. I spent 6 years working for Accenture, doing IT consulting, helping major organizations re-engineer their systems and then design, develop, and plug in system-wide, enterprise-wide IT systems. I got an MBA in 1999, did strat consultancy work for a few years after that. Then I did my first startup, which was an online food services concept. And if you think about this, in 2001, I was thinking about novel ways to get food to people and using the web to do so. You might have heard of other models that do that today and do that in spades. So, there may be this idea of being a little before my time, but it was clearly something that was growing in usage, certainly in corporate circles. And so that was my first foray into early stage ventures. I did a few years in a private equity firm, then did very novel material development in photovoltaics, got into the solar world, spent multiple years there and founded divisions in large multinationals. So I call that an intrapreneurship experience, since it was within the confines of a big company, but we were founding new divisions from scratch. And I actually wrote a business plan to do so and had to pitch it to the board and to the CEO to get it funded. So, and then after that, this last decade largely has been in healthcare. So I pivoted industry, but kept the same concept of developing novel ideas. Launched a device company, a diagnostic company in 2003, if I remember correctly. Then launched a grafting company with a friend that was a mechanical device that was doing tissue or skin grafting. Then moved on to the care provider side. So the provider is the doctor, for instance, who provides the care versus the device side. So worked with a home wound care. So these devices, by the way, were in wound care, W-O-U-N-D. This home healthcare provider was delivering precision wound care services to patients at home. So it was sort of in my an area of expertise that I developed after a few years of being a device guy. Worked on the healthcare provider side with home care, home delivered wound care. And then launched a company that was trying to sort of re-envisage how healthcare generally is accessed in this country. Launched an AI company that was trying to bring much better economics to the concept of bringing emergent care to patients at home. Sort of bring the emergency room to people at home is the general concept. And that's, and it's probably an unsurprising trend that you're aware of, that much of care, certainly telehealth, but even before telehealth and even now with telehealth, there's still a need for physical care that's brought to patients where they are, whether you're at home, whether you're in your office, whether you're out in the world or where have you, but the idea that care comes to you versus you going to care. And we've been pioneering different ideas and models employing AI to do so. And then very recently, only months into it, working with a friend on a new novel pain management technique to deliver a nerve block. So that's the quick summary. The size is how much time I've spent with each, and that's how I've kind of spent the last 3 decades. So maybe, and again, in the spirit of being interactive, would love to get your reactions. What do you think about this career trajectory? A lot of people look at my background and give me a lot of different opinions on how I've done and what I've done, and how I've sort of threaded experience through that. What do you think? How do you react to that? How have I done sort of managing my career?
We have a question from John Miller. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just kind of an interesting comment. I think that the third decade is into the healthcare space. I was curious about how you kind of broke into that after kind of amassing expertise in a variety, like a diversity of fields. But it seems that that's very specific compared to food services and consulting. So curious about that.
Good observation, John. That's right on. And I get asked that question a lot. And quite commonly, I actually refer back to my engineering roots. I think part of what I learned when I was an engineer was, as I discussed, sort of, if there's a framework that we are taught, not a framework, or sort of an approach that we learn as engineers. It's how to take problems, how to understand problems, break them into digestible pieces, and then and go after them and fix them. And so that's fundamentally the toolkit I feel that I brought to each one of those. And every industry has those problems. You do have to learn in some cases, especially like in medicine, you have to learn a new language, you have to learn new environments in which you work. But it was the same when I was in solar. I had to learn a lot of new participants, a lot of new terminology, a lot of how things are done in the industry. So that's the piece that I learned. But I think the part of being a consultant for so long also helped me figure out how to learn quickly and come up to speed quickly, and then deliver value quickly. So looking both at my sort of engineering toolkit and also the consulting toolkit, those were deployed in every single case. But I will tell you, and I don't want to belittle this, is that I spent a lot of time reading, months reading to get smart. Because when you go in front of an expert in a field, notably in healthcare, for instance, a doctor, if you as simple as use the wrong language or miscommunicate ideas or don't present with enough credibility that you've done your homework, you often don't get second opportunities. So it wasn't easy, but that's how I've bridged it. Any other comments on the career trajectory? Does it look planned? Does it look random? Does it look what comes to mind? Anyone else? All right. Well, maybe we'll collect some thoughts. I'd like to come back to this. In fact, I'll tell you a little more about whether it was or whether it was not. So if that's the path, sort of how I really manage my career, so to speak, I'll tell you. So if now you get to see the man behind the curtain, to use the Wizard of Oz analogy. So from the IT consultancy, it turns out Accenture was one of the biggest recruiters out of they only recruited in the engineering college when I was a student, and they were one of the largest recruiters. So I at least wanted to check it out. And then the options that I had were Wall Street or global IT with Accenture, or PwC. Actually had an offer from them as well. And the truth of the matter is, I knew very little about Wall Street. Now knowing what I know, maybe I would have done that and gone on a completely different path. But the idea of using my software roots as an electrical engineer, did a lot of programming. It seemed more in my sweet spot, and I had the opportunity to travel the world. And those are kind of the two big reasons why I went to consultancy. And then 6 years later, I was having too much fun. If you can see all the clutter, if I could rudely call it that, behind me, I did a lot of traveling all over the world, and I was having too much fun. And my wife sat me down and she said, if I didn't go to business school then, which I had always wanted to, that I was never going to. So I was 6 years, with 6 years of experience. I then went into the B school. In fact, I was so sort of, my heart was not as into it as much as I should have. I waited until the very day that the application was due. And since we lived here in Boston, I just walked it down the street to the nearest business school, is how I describe it. A little bit tongue in cheek. I would not recommend that strategy. I applied to one school and applied on the last day. I certainly would not recommend that strategy, but every once in a while, luck is what you rely on as well. And then I wanted to do, after business school, I wanted to do an internet startup. I graduated in '99. It seems like a long time ago, but that was in the boom of the internet years. And so I wanted to do one, but I didn't have a specific passion and idea. So for lack of a better answer, I went to a consultancy that was working with a lot of internet startups. And at the time, by the way, when I graduated in '99, I had my first child. So the young woman that you saw earlier, if I can go back to it here. This young woman is my daughter, Jackie. She's now 21, if you can believe that. This is her when we had her many years ago in '99. But, you know, and after working 2 years in a strat consultancy, I was traveling a lot, I was working a lot of hours, and then the internet bubble burst. And we had taken a lot of equity in lieu of cash, which was one of the reasons I went to that consultancy. And it turns out that when equity is worth nothing and the electric company doesn't allow you to pay your bills with equity. So the firm that I was with had struggled. And in fact, it came very close to going out of business. And I was a weekend father. I just had my first child. And I was a weekend father traveling every single week practically. And for me, that was really untenable. So since I wanted to spend more time, that really pushed me into the idea of being my own boss. I wanted more control over what I was doing. I wanted to be able to spend time with my daughter, you know, be able to go into class and spend an hour there in her classroom if that's something that I wanted to do. So that's what really prompted me to look at the entrepreneurial approach. And with my experience in consulting, I chose online food services because in professional environments, which Boston was ripe with them, think management consultants, think law firms, think financial firms, think financial consultants and money managers, you know, that sort of profile. New York clearly has a lot, but Boston has a lot of those. The price of a sandwich is very cheap for what it does for morale, building teamwork and camaraderie. And so we brought food in almost constantly for meals. Teams would eat together. We would have the whole company in the office on Fridays. And again, I think those were typical across those professional services firms. So I thought, you know, and it was a very disorganized process in how to do that. And I talked with several of the assistants in our offices and figured there was a much better way to do it. And so that was the first foray into food services. Built that over many different years. And I'll come back to sort of the measure of success, but just to say that then, you know, I spent 2 years in private equity, and then the 2008 recession hit. So again, not by choice, but because the firm had great difficulty when management fees evaporated, I launched into photovoltaics. And here's the crazy thing is that opportunity, you know, I'm talking to a lot of people, networking and trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. I found that opportunity on a job board. Now you probably hear all the time that going to job boards is a complete black hole. You send resumes into them, they go absolutely nowhere. And that is certainly and largely true. But I will say again, you know, if you want to call it luck, if you want to call it right time, right place, you know, spoke with a person that had posted this posting on a job board through the listing. And it turned out to be a fabulous little stint. I worked for 2 years in a big company that was trying to do novel growth platforms. So I was able to write a business plan and launch a brand new division. So it was very exciting, actually. It turned out to be much more interesting than I thought it would be for a big co-experience. And then the med device thing, and this is back to your question, you know, it kind of fell in my lap. I had a friend that, you know, I was looking again, you know, after I had done this innovation, I had a friend that said that, you know, he happened to be an executive in a wound care company, and he said that he had a scientist that came at his office and said, "I got the greatest thing since sliced bread." And of course, you can imagine a lot of entrepreneurs say that. But my buddy thought he had something interesting, but he was a scientist, and he probably didn't have the capability to take what he was working on from the laboratory out to the marketplace to commercialize the idea. So my friend introduced us, and you know, thinking that I could help him with the pieces that he was lacking. And I love the idea. I did my own diligence and decided to pursue that diagnostic, and that was my first foray. And then I did sort of repeat after that. I worked on a grafting device, worked in the healthcare providers that I talked about. And the grafting device, I met the founder because I happened to be knocking around in wound care, and he said, "You're the guy that we need to do these kinds of things of what's missing in our company." And then after that, in the healthcare provider, it was the same thing. It was a friend of mine in a private equity firm had just bought this wound care services firm, and we were chatting at a reunion, and I told him that I happened to be a wound care guy from a device standpoint. And he looked at me askance and he said, "Wound care? I mean, you don't hear that very often, right?" He said, you know, that he had a company in Florida that was in multiple states and was going through growing pains and needed some complete realignment. So, you know, it was sort of, again, a bit of a happenstance sort of thing. Then the AI thing, you know, it's a friend of a friend again. These physicians put together a novel idea, but we're looking for sort of a CEO founder to come on board and get the idea off the ground. And then the last one, it's an old friend that said, "I'm doing it again and need somebody who's done it, come join me." So, you know, if there's a thread there, My wife certainly doesn't see it. And so, if there, now that you've seen it, I'd love to hear what you have to say. My wife says my career has been more of sort of a pinball sort of approach so far. But I don't know. What do you think about that? That showed you a little bit of the insight of how each step works. Does that give you any ideas that change your opinion? What are your thoughts now about how I have managed my career, or what you might take from it? Anyone want to comment?
I think it's really interesting that, in the beginning you look at the 3 different decades, but I think it's really great that you prioritize your family. And I think that's certainly a consideration to make in the future, that, in hindsight, you can kind of classify your career in terms of the fields, but then in terms of navigating your personal journey, it's a little bit different, and making the choices there to optimize that is certainly something to take into consideration.
I appreciate that, John. Thanks for that observation.
I think the other thing is that it just shows how iterative everything is, especially like within, I guess it kind of is a theme for all entrepreneurship, but, if you were to plan all very far ahead that like, you wanted to do this big internet startup, your plans would have been like busted as soon as 2001 hit. But the fact that you reacted to circumstances and found something new that you were interested in, I think made you jump into where you are today.
Well, thank you for that observation, Rishi. And maybe I'll just extrapolate that comment, is that it is very personal and specific. It depends on your appetite. I'd like to describe it as being opportunist, and a lot of people find that very unattractive. A lot of people like to have plans and have life largely planned out, in terms of thinking. And I'll be candid. Even when I went to Cornell, I was an electrical engineer because my father taught electrical engineering at the University of Houston. And for lack of a better answer, and having tinkered around with tons of devices in our home, I thought that, I loved it, enjoyed it. So it was kind of, why not? So I think, if anything, that's sort of the thread that I would weave, is that it is a bit opportunistic in a lot of ways. Any other comments? All right. And remember, jump in anytime, please. We'd love to hear from you at any point. So, now you're going to ask me, all right, so Paul, you've talked about a lot of different startups. Well, how'd you do? Let's look at some of the measures that you might want to assess startups. If you look at just, the most traditional aspect, where they acquired, went on, where they financial successes, that kind of thing. And without getting into a lot of specificity, let's just be quick. So, if I put all 6 of them on the map here, let's say 5, because the last one really months into it. But if we put all 5 on the map here, if I were in baseball, I would have a hitting average of a 400, which for baseball is pretty good. But for startups, you could argue that's good, that's bad, that's indifferent. I don't know. The first one, the food services company, was acquired by a largest competitor. The photovoltaics business that we set up was shut down by the company. The diagnostic, I say sideways because I continue to work on it. It's still active, albeit very, very slow burn. And save for number 5, the health delivery AI company. Worked on it for about a year. Didn't hit all the milestones we wanted, so it's still active, but I'd say, very low burn right now. And the grafting device was acquired. So that's kind of how I came up with this 2 out of 5. 2 are acquired. 2, the other 3 are either shut down or still sort of percolating, but only mildly. So so that's the story. Now, the question is, what's going to happen on the 6th? We all love to read about the serial entrepreneurs who do one after another, after another, after another of these successes. I think part of it is that we don't talk about the ones that failed, but at the same time, do you think there's any indication of how well I'm going to do on number 6? Where would you place your bets? How about I cold call someone? Do we allow that? Professor Callister, can we cold call?
Sure, go ahead. Let's see what happens.
Tell you what, I'll pick on my friends. I see a good friend, Randy, on the call. Randy, so I have a batting average of 400, and I just launched number 6. What do you think? Is he going to succeed or not?
You have my full confidence.
See, that's what happens when you ask a good friend, right? Well, if I see Velicia's on the call, she's a dear friend too. She works in in high finance, and if anything, if you look at the exceptions they put at the bottom of mutual funds, They say that, past performance is no indication, historical performance is no indication of future performance. So maybe that's my story and I'll stick to it.
Quick question though, like while it's obviously important to like kind of look at the end product, is this like seriously the most important part of like these experiences? Because I would think that maybe the embedded learning or kind of the lessons you take away are maybe if not as important as kind of the kind of colored acquired shutdown sideways end product.
John, another way to, if I may, and push back on me, I might reframe your question, which is, look at regrets. What did I get out of these experiences, and and how do I look back sort of retrospectively and characterize the experience? And that's a very personal question. Other people may look at this and say, we see this a lot, particularly in movies, right? That people might be motivated not even by how much money they make, but by the fact that they just can keep doing it. This old adage that there's never enough when it comes to how much money can you make. So your point is right on. I look at some of these, it has been certainly volatile. There's been high highs and there's been low lows. My wife will tell you that she wishes that it was much more steady throughout the whole experience. But I personally would agree with you completely that, if I look at my experiences, they have made me who I am today. They have sort of put the experience in me. I can talk about the failures, which I have learned probably more from than I have from my successes. You've heard that as a platitude, but that is certainly the case. And I take that experience with me every time. And I do a lot of work with startups now. And I hope and I think that I impart some of the trepidation or where I tripped in the past, I can bring that to those. So, in those sense, are there failures? Certainly, or, in terms of where I am today and who I am and what I enjoy, they have all been fabulous experiences by those measures. You're right on. I will say, I'd like to make one observation. You notice that, this one that was shut down, that was not my decision. That was the one that I founded a new division within a big company. But I'll tell you one thing that I'm still learning. And if you look at the two yellow, the sideways versus the shutdown, I have a hard time with this. And this is common with entrepreneurs, is that when you work hard, you put a lot of sweat and love into something like your own baby. If I were to call these startups my babies, it's really hard to let go. And that's the phenomenon you see with number 3 and 5. You could arguably say number 3 has been around for almost 8 years, and that I should have pulled the plug on that a long time ago. And it'd be very hard for me to argue that. And I could give you very good reasons why I have not. But in number 2, and this is where large companies are, that was a Fortune 500 company, by the way. So when you look at decision making in those companies, you could argue until you're blue in the face of the quality of the decision making or the outcomes. But that's not my point. My point is that when a decision is made, it's really cut bait and move on. And there's a lot to be said for that strategy. I can be accused of continuing to invest my time and my very valuable time in concepts that may have no legs and may never have no legs. And that is something that I'm still learning to this day. And that's something that, even though it was difficult because I was on the receiving end when our division was shut down, it was shut down and that was the end of the story. There was no more burn and there was no more loss of attention. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be taken from that as well. Now, I think I already feel like I'm talking a little bit too much, but one thing that you do learn, I think, John, to your comment, what have I learned? And the most important thing is what I've learned about myself, because that helps me be smarter about doing things where I can have much bigger impact in what I do next, and be smarter about what I'm capable of and what I'm not capable of. So I've created this list of likes, dislikes, and must-haves. So a couple of things. Obviously I have a huge appetite for career and financial risk, and a lot of people do not have that. You have to have quite a stomach to be able to ride the roller coaster. And if you don't have it, if you need a more structured career, if the volatility really makes it hard for you to function, then there's some things that you should probably steer away from. I'll talk about some of the dislikes. There are times my wife is like, you got to move on, you got to try something else, and she has looked at my experience in big companies, and I have A, loved that experience, and B, done very well, kind of risen through the ranks, so to speak. And so she comes back to that. She's like, Paul, listen, you should obviously take lessons from that maybe you should be in a big company. And I think, there's never extreme clarity on who somebody is. Is somebody an entrepreneur or somebody a big company person? I think those are nothing more than monikers, and they have very little meaning. And frankly, it's a pendulum, and you might have a bit of all the above. And so it depends on. That's why it's important to know who you are and what you've learned from past experience. And one thing like must-haves, as I look at things when I want to pursue them, for me, it's important to work with other people. My ideas get so much better when I have the chance to talk to someone about them and have them challenge me, and then we come out with better ideas. So I've learned that about myself. And the other thing is, as I showed you earlier, the yellow ones, the ones that go sideways, it's good to have people to put fire under your feet to say, you had a plan, here are the metrics, you're off base, what are you doing about it? And not allow sort of, the entrepreneur to convince him or herself that this something, the big success is right around the corner. That's a very common fallacy with entrepreneurs that are spending a lot of time on something. So, learning from past experience, and again, I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit too obvious, but it's really critical that you do a bit of an inventory that helps reframe what you're looking for as you go forward in next careers and next ideas. So listen, Professor Callister asked that we focus on some very specific lessons. So now that we've kind of done with the platitude part, let's dig into some of the startups. So the first startup, the food services one, I bootstrapped it, launched it with our own finances. I was the first CEO, sales rep, janitor, secretary. I held every hat. And guess what? Since it was my first, I thought I could do absolutely every hat. Now, what you see on the screen right now is a graph of revenue. So don't even worry about the axes. Just look at the line, really. So in the first year, it took me a while to get the concept out there, inculcated, and start to get customers. But guess what? I got customers and started to collect a little bit of revenue. Now, looking at this, so 1 year into it, look at it through the eyes of an investor. If I came to you and said, I launched this company, got the idea working, went and talked to some customers and got them to buy into it. If I were now to ask you to say, I'm 1 year into it, I'm raising $1 million, would you write me the check? Assume you got the money in the bank and you're an investor. Looking at that graph, what do you think? Would you write me $1 million or $1 million check? Anyone?
I think your revenue is stagnant over the year, and it would be difficult for investors to really give you that money. So yeah.
All right, good point, Rishi. Thank you. Nice to see you. Other comments?
I mean, maybe you need an investment to unstagnate that revenue. I don't know.
All right. Very interesting. Let's go a little further. Let me give you another year, see if your ideas change. So you might use the same word. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? By the way, tell me if I ever forget to share screen. So so there's another year. So it shows improvement, but unfortunately you could use the same S word, stagnation. Any change of opinion? Is this getting better? Is this getting worse? Well, what should I be thinking as the entrepreneur, do you think? I'll tell you, as the entrepreneur, I'm thinking, this is working, right? I mean, revenue is amazing. I mean, if you look at revenue is the real sign that you have an idea that resonates in your marketplace. So if you look at this, I can say that, look, I built it up to this point and, I plateau, but I got customers that are interested. So there's something that I'm not doing because the market's not, I'm not doing well because the market is there. But I will say that after 2 years, this line, you could almost argue is relatively flat, right? Your stagnation comments. So if that's the case, you could start making arguments very compellingly that, look, this idea is interesting, but it's probably not going to amount to something. You might want to pull the plug. Well, I was stubborn. And as you say, as I've already told you, I've confessed to some of my shortcomings, which is I let things go sideways for a while before I really, faced the reality. But it turns out around month 31, I signed on a big customer and they didn't request that all their employees use it. They forced all their employees to use it because they wanted to consolidate everything. And one customer completely changed the profile of what the company looked like. And that changed exactly the trajectory of the company. Now, so the message is not, stick it out forever because ultimately it's going to change. That's not really the message. The message is that you have to have metrics in place to say, are you heading in the right direction? Do you have the chance of getting this to head in the right direction? And certainly give it a chance, but at some level, you still have to find a way to keep a timeline on what you're doing. So again, I'm going to use this word often because I'm going to give credit where credit is due. So luck. I had been working on wrong strategies here, change strategy, and it flipped. So the first one happened to be successful. But I think part of the takeaway here and part of the explanations for the stagnation is that, do you think I was the guy that should have been doing this? If me working on it for 2 years produced this, what might that tell you about if I was the right guy to be doing that job? Assuming other things were largely intact. It's a good product, the market was there, and other important pillars of a business. But if this is the result, I think one conclusion you could say is maybe it's the wrong guy. And I think that's part of the problem. So this "I got this" mentality. Look, we're all Cornell trained. We have, or we will all have an Ivy League degree soon if we don't have one already. And I'll tell you another quick story, because this is one that to this day it makes me smile. I showed you that picture of our family in Turkey. This is the beaches of Çeşme along the coast of Turkey, and we were trying to get over here. If you can see where my cursor is on the destination area. And I saw that there was a route that was being traversed by cars, and we had a small rental car. So I came to the clear conclusion that I would be able to drive us to that far distant point by going along the beach. So, and the theme that I want to ask you here is, do you have the right resource, deployed in the right ways, the right people? Do you have the right money, the right equipment, the right time, or, some other resource deployed in the right way? In this case, I said, I have a car, I see a road, and this is where I want to go. I got this. Well, here's what happened, is that I decided to cut this picture off, because sitting behind the driver's seat, and I'm not going to tell you who it was, there's a guy that said, don't worry, I got this. And then soon, he's hiding his face under the steering wheel. It's a Cornell engineer, and I'm protecting his identity. He got the rental car stuck in the sand. This is his wife, by the way. She is the wife of the not to be named Cornell engineer, and she's not very happy. This is what she looks like from behind, but this is what she looks like if you could see the front. And she says that in this picture, she's helping push the car. Now, you tell me, is she helping push the car, or do you think she's quite upset with this not to be named engineer? These two people are Nikki and Alex, right? Look at them. They're putting their, God love these two, my sons. They're putting their might into the problem that we're trying to solve. And not shown is my daughter, who's taking this picture. So anyway, the message here is that I thought I had it. And the truth was I didn't have it. And I think I bit off a lot more than I could chew. Another lesson, the big division that I founded in a major multinational company happened to be a clean energy division. And we wrote this beautiful business plan. We had detailed product roadmaps along multiple investment themes in clean energy, from solar to wind to even some tidal and other renewable generation technologies that the company that I was now working in that we could have launched. We had a go-to-market plan starting in photovoltaics. We developed a product internally. In fact, it's this layer of a solar module. It's called the backsheet. And without getting into a lot of detail, there's a lot of function that sheet needs to perform. And we could do it better, cheaper, with less investment, and so on. And we already had a product in testing with major module manufacturers. And then guess what? The company hires a consultant, and they say that they need to sort of profit from the core was the theme. And they decided that all new and innovative concepts should be put on hold. And so that was the example that I gave you, where they were very clear and said, all right, we're done with this and we need to go on. Now, they were great to me because they had given me 3 PhD researchers. They'd given me a big budget, and they'd given me manufacturing facilities all over the world, because there was a lot of investment going on in China and in Europe. So I was flying back and forth. And it was a fabulous experience until all of a sudden the plug was pulled. And I think a big lesson that I took away from that is that as you go through a development, or as you start to build things, you need to have early wins. You need to be able to go back to your stakeholders. Your stakeholders could be your wife, they could be investors, it could be a CEO, it could be your employees. And it could be yourself, it could be investors. But the point is, you need to go back to your stakeholders with a plan, and then you need to have some early wins to demonstrate that you're moving in the right direction. And part of that is communication. And I think I did a bad job, quite candidly, of keeping the CEO in the loop. I would, because it took time to test and so on, and I can give you 1,000 excuses. But had I think I'd done a better job of communicating the progress we were making, the response of the market, the testing that was going on, and the fact that we had come out of nowhere and were already known in the industry, and the top 3 module manufacturers in the world were evaluating our products. I'm not sure we would have gotten to the point where the CEO would have said, I need to cut this because I'm not seeing progress, and he pulled the plug. And we weren't really asked for feedback at that point. We were basically told we need to curtail these entire divisions. So, I think early wins is something to be very sensitive to and make sure you build that into your plans. Iteration, Rishi, you said this in your comments, iterating or tinkering is an important aspect of what we do. If you don't have multiple sort of points of feedback, then you run the risk of getting disconnected from understanding the value you create and talking with your customers. In fact, in the company, when I was working in that multinational, one of my friends coined the phrase, spend a little, learn a lot. And the only thing I'd add to that is spend a little to learn a lot sooner. This idea of get just something that people can react to. People don't like PowerPoints, they like to touch things and feel things. If you can give them that opportunity, you will come away much smarter and much more on target than you were before. So one of my favorite examples, so nothing related to me, but one of my favorite examples is when Chevy launched the Nova. I don't know if it was launched in '74, but that's the model 74. When they launched it in Mexico, thinking this was going to be a wildly popular and populous car, meeting the masses. But it turns out that Nova in Spanish, means doesn't go. And so, that sort of insensitivity, the fact that they brought it out in their first and most important target market, they would have learned very quickly that there were some aspects of it, notably the name, that was going to stifle its adoption. And then in my experience, what the diagnostic that we developed, you can see it here. So it's a diagnostic for chronic wounds. So I'm sorry for the picture that may be a little unpleasant. But when we took it out, our idea was, put it out there, you can diagnose the wounds and it'll help indicate different treatments. But, people kind of scratched their heads. That was a little bit too broad of messaging. So we weren't very clear in how we were communicating the value of what it does. And we had a sales rep of all people that I was just meeting over lunch at a trade show. When I described it to him, he basically said, you know what, that could help me a lot, because when I go in, I have this sophisticated biologic product, and doctors ask me all the time, how do I know when to use your product? And if there was a concept of a companion diagnostic that could help identify wounds that would be indicated for my therapy, that would be a huge winner. In fact, we wouldn't even have to acquire it as it's a development expense. It could be a marketing expense because it would drive our top line. So anyway, long story short, we went by sharing what we were doing, we learned much more clearly how we needed to talk about and to position the concept that we were working on. And that's only through iteration. In startup number 4, it's a skin grafting device. And what you see here, there's a lot of science behind this, so I won't go into it. But this is how we harvested human skin tissue. We did autologous grafting. On the left was our prototype device. Each one of those blue dots was basically a cannula. It was a needle, a hollow needle that would drill cores of skin and harvest those cores. Now, there's a lot of science about why this was very novel and impactful and very much better for the patient. But from an engineering or device standpoint, it turns out that this prototype idea was a very simple device to use. It had a few extra steps, but it was very simple. It was small, handheld, and the clinicians in our trials were able to use it quite easily. When we thought about taking the device to market, we learned that 80% of chronic wounds were about a square inch in area. And so what we did then is decided to augment that area of skin harvest to cover about a square inch, so that doctors only needed to do one procedure: harvest and then deposit the tissue into the receiving wounded area with only one motion: harvest and scatter. So that was the idea. And so, we thought it was going to be a much more attractive product by making it tailored to 80% of the type of wounds that might walk into a wound clinic. So this idea of minimal viable product, by the way, I hate the term MVP simply because of the word minimal. Minimal, I think, communicates the wrong idea. I think it's really, what is the sort of viable product to get you started, whatever that acronym may work out to be. So you need to work out what that means for you, but it's a very important concept. Like, for instance, if I ask you to develop, if there's no cars that, and no means of transport other than horse-drawn carriages, and I ask you to develop a horseless transport so grandma can go for a home to the market and back, what would you think about building? There are a whole bunch of ideas might come to mind, one of which is a donkey. Maybe the problem is that stables for horses are too big, and if you had a smaller animal, you might solve the problem. So maybe one answer is a donkey, right? Another answer is maybe you're in the Netherlands and there's canals everywhere. You could get your grandmother to the grocery store via boat. But the problem is maybe that doesn't work for every grandmother. Then there's different modes with wheels, and then it talks about what is their innovation, or what is their what propels them? Is it human powered? Is it motor powered? Or is it some other sort of other fuel powered? And so there's lots of ways to do it. And so thinking about the right idea, the right fit to start with is very important. Had we gone with something like this, would have taken us, into market, and then would have taken us maybe a little more time to launch it, but we would have gotten in and learned a lot. Instead, we went for the fancy hovercraft vehicle. And, guess what? Remarkably, we sold this product to a major medical products distributor pre-revenue. We didn't have a dime of revenue. But after acquisition, they took our engineering team aside and they basically said, look, what we've developed here was over-engineered, and there were a few shortcomings. Its failure rate was a little bit too high and unacceptable in the opinion of the big multinational. So anyway, long story short, we over-engineered this concept. We created something that had to have many gears, engagement. It had to have a panel with lights and dashboards and buttons, whereas the earlier device would have harvested tissue only in multiple steps without any of that complexity. So this idea of managing risk is very important when you think about where do you want to start. You can certainly you can have a roadmap to get to where you want to be, but that first step could be make or break for any startup, especially a device startup. Learn fast. When you have problems, the most natural human way to react to problems is almost to ignore them. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but if you think about how we deal with things, things that we don't like, we tend to retract from, and we stick our head in the sand. And that strategy usually never works, and it brings bad. In fact, things can get even worse. It can bring worse consequences. The most notable case where there's problems in early stage companies has to do with people, whether that's an employee, a board member, or co-founder. If you have someone that is a problem, having that person linger around can be really deadly. In fact, it can be the death of early stage startups. As one example, a CEO was evaluating joining an early stage company with another co-founding set. They needed a CEO to run it. One of the co-founders was offering, thinking that everything was all in place, they just needed the CEO to act. And so was offering a very, a lowball offer. The CEO ended up negotiating a fair and more market offer and started working. But those red flags continued. That one board member throughout the year, continually was let's just say undermined the CEO. And there were red flags at the beginning, throughout the year, and then finally the CEO needed to resign and walk away from that role. And I'm talking in generalities here, but that CEO was me. There were red flags that I should have picked up on more importantly in the beginning, that I did, by the way, but I ignored them. I said, I'll fix that, I'll deal with that, or I'll deal with it later. And the truth is, when you have problems that you identify, if you don't approach them and fix them early, they get much worse later. So, I wasted a lot of time in that experience. So listen, I could clearly go on and on and on. We're running out of time, but I'm not going to bore you to death. I'd like to say, just one thing. Why do I do this? And there's lots of people on this webinar that give a lot of time and money and talent to Cornell. And I think this is important. Why do I do these kinds of things? Why do I love working with students? Why do I love mentoring lots of different organizations and enterprises? and why do I spend a lot of time, working with my alma mater? And simply, I love my time when I was on campus. I grew as I came, I think, as a young, very naive person, and I left a very different person. And I grew immeasurably across almost any metric that you can think of. Obviously, I met my wife, and I met many, many other people while there, and many that I still stay in touch with. And I include my wife in that, by the way, as people that I stay in touch with. I continue to learn from the relationship. I still get, so to speak, from the relationship. The chance to hear latest research from faculty, to hear about how Cornell deals with the problems of academia in the modern world, to interact with folks like Professor Callister, who are trying to invent or reinvent or bring entrepreneurship in a more vibrant way onto the campus, is very meaningful for me. And so, this give back and pay forward mentality, it was inculcated from the very beginning. I was raised by 2 teachers, and I was a Boy Scout. And our motto was always that when you go camping, no one could ever notice that you camp there, and the campground has to be in better condition than when you left. And I think that same applies to this earth. I think of the earth the same way, that I do my part to be a steward. That's what we are, and that's what I am, is a steward of what I was given. And my job is to make certain it's as good, but more importantly, better by the time I leave. And listen, it's great fun. It's an honor for me to be here. I'm thrilled to be in audience with you, and would love to hear what you have to say.
Please
You
go.
guys are all awake, right?
Go ahead.
I have a question. So in the situation where one of the co-founders was trying to undercut you as CEO, I guess what could you have done like earlier on to sort of maybe resolve the problem, move forward, or maybe even walk out earlier instead of having to wait a year?
Yeah, Emerson, good question. The term stakeholder, it's a very important term. And I think we very narrowly think about who our stakeholders are in anything that we do. In everything that we do, there are stakeholders. And it behooves you to think more broadly about who those stakeholders are, who has an interest, or who's affected by, or who has a say in the affairs of what you're doing. And that's how you think about stakeholders. And the more broadly you think about that, I think the more successful you can be if you manage those stakeholders well. And I think that's where I failed, is that we set up a board of 3 people. So that gentleman was only one of 3. I was one of those 3 as well. So there was a third. And the other 2 had a good relationship. But I do think that the third gentleman was also, he was a good listener. He's willing to, listen to the facts. And unfortunately, what I did is I let it linger so long that those 2, this third guy would observe our relationship and the fact that it was getting taxed more and more by every board meeting and every interaction. And instead of me doing good stakeholder management and reaching out to other players, like, for instance, the one on the board, but also one of our co-founders that was not on the board, I let that sit until I got to the point where it was obvious that there was tension. And at that point, it was very difficult for me, I think, to sort of step back and pull some of these other stakeholders onto my side, or at least, share with them what the problems were and how I think we could rectify them, which was removal of this third guy. And it got to the point where I let it go too long, where it was a little bit too disastrous and a little bit too difficult to walk back from. So that was my biggest failing, I believe. Coalitions, I think it's important within what you do. You got to have friends, and you got to have friends along the way, and think of that in a whole different framework. Think of it, friendship, think of friends not as friendship, but think of it as coalitions with all the stakeholders that you might be involved in. You need to keep them in the loop. That's part of the the early wins concept as well, is that I failed to communicate sort of what I thought were really wildly impressive successes that we were having early. And had I done that, I think the mentality and the approach when problems got worse or new problems came up, there could have been different outcomes.
You said that your second startup got shut down, but that was not your decision. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. That's the division in the major company. So, you know, it's easy to blame on the consultant. I was a consultant, so it's easier for me to blame consultants. The consultant came in and advised the CEO of that multinational that you now need to profit from your core, and you shouldn't be wasting time with you know, new innovations because they're expensive and they're long-term timeframes to pay off. And so that's what he decided to do. And he decided to cut all innovation. And by definition, what we were doing was innovation. And so that was the end result, Rishi. But I'll tell you, it was an easy end result because of the fact that I didn't deliver those early wins and I didn't manage the stakeholders as well as I should on a more frequent basis. You know, I kind of had the impression in both cases that I'll go off, I'll do my good work, and the results will speak for themselves. That's not true in the real world. I mean, because a lot of times the time in between, if you are silent or if you are absent, then it leaves opportunity for things to go wrong. So you have to be active on managing the relationships in those coalitions. And that's also what led to, you know, the troubles. Well, that's what led to the easy conclusion that we're not generating revenue, we're just incurring costs, so we need to cut new innovations.
What was the time frame of that photovoltaic decision there?
Hey, Tom. Yeah, it was about just over 2 years. And I'll tell you, you know, there are many.
What year was that?
Oh, circa 2000, I think 8 to 10, and roughly in that time frame. So, by the way, if you're asking, I may know why you're asking. At the tail end of what we were doing, photovoltaic industry completely imploded because of price points.
Yep.
Yeah.
You and I were talking about this while I just finished a project that was 50 kilowatt, which turned out to be like the third largest in the Northeast. And everybody thought everything was going to take off, and then I don't know what happened there, but
yes, that's exactly. So right after this happened, so this was an internal decision by the company to stick to their core competency, as we love to call it in business circles. But Tom, you're exactly right. Not even months later. I mean, because I did work then with another industrial manufacturer to set up a photovoltaic business, and that effort after 6 months completely ended because the price of modules, the watt price per modules went completely through the floor, and nobody could make money. So nobody was investing in innovation at that point. That happened just after.
So what do you think about the current plan for lots of infrastructure spending in clean tech? Is this a good time for that?
Yeah, you know, I'm a few years now removed from clean tech, but where photovoltaic prices are, as an example, this is a fabulous time for it. You know, there's an old adage, there's an old calculation that was made that, you know, if you look, I can't remember if it was, let's just call it 100 by 100 mile, 100 miles by 100 miles in the desert of Nevada. If you put solar panels in that, you know, 100 by 100 postage stamp size, you know, footprint on a map in Nevada, you could power this entire country. There's some distribution and lots of other problems, but theoretically, the output from an array that size would power this entire country with absolutely no fossil fuel use. So, you know, and with the prices of solar right now, it's extraordinary, and it's the same with wind. You know, wind is susceptible to the problem of siting. You know, you have to find good sites that make wind interesting, but it is by far the right idea. You know, I'm an asthmatic, by the way. I grew up in Houston, Texas. One thing that I loved about when I arrived in Ithaca, I put my inhaler away, by the way. You know, the whole, you guys, well, everyone knows the story why Eurus Hall is brown rust versus versus the beautiful green patina of brass, right? Or of copper, excuse me. There's no pollution in Ithaca. Apparently that's important to get that proper patina. But for me, it was a great boon to my health. And, you know, so for a lot of reasons, we have no choice. We have to invest in cleaner fuels. And economically, it's pretty much on parity now. Please correct me, you know, Tom or anyone else. But, you know, when I was there, we needed incentives. But now, now renewable energy is pretty much on parity without subsidy. So it's within spitting distance of being so. So that's the measure. Once that really happens, there's no reason we should do anything other than renewable generation.
Yeah, they're on parity. A big issue now too is batteries are starting to come down in cost. That, you know, there's some progress in this semiconductor battery, so you don't have the lithium and other rare earth minerals you have to worry about. And the big thing is, you know, the generation mix across this country is quite different. So if you're in Vermont, for example, they peak more like 6 o'clock at night because people come home and they plug in their cars to regenerate. You go somewhere else like Texas, and it's still probably the traditional curve where the peak is during the day. So the ability to deal with variance and then store the energy and then use it when it's most expensive or cleanest is going to, you know, how to dispatch that is going to be a big thing, I think. And we're coming, all those things are starting to intersect. So
Thank you,
and
Tom. Storage. Yeah, it's.
I had just retired, so I'm going to miss out on a lot of that.
Right on.
Well, you mentioned many reasons why you like to stay in touch with the Hill. And I think this is the perfect example of how the College of Engineering is a place that I like to keep in touch with. Lyndon Archer, Dean Archer is, I think, putting together a team that's right at the nexus of this problem of, you know, cheap manufacturing of electricity, if you will, but difficulty having it at the time and the place when you want it.
Right on, Randy. Yep.
All right, well, we're out of time, so thank you everybody for attending today's talk. Let's unmute and give a old-fashioned for our speaker. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Paul.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. It was very entertaining and illuminating, so we really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming, and this ends our talk today. Have a good night.
Nice to see everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.